I froze in horror as the rumble of motorcycles surrounded our home. Through my car window, I could see my 5-year-old son Michael sitting on our front lawn, his small body shaking with sobs as he desperately reached out for Cooper, his German Shepherd guide dog. A circle of leather-clad bikers had formed around them, one man with a skull bandana already holding Cooper's leash while another gestured threateningly toward my blind child. "The dog's coming with us, kid." "OE orders," the largest biker growled, his tattooed arms folded across his chest as Michael's face crumpled in terror. My son's world had already been reduced to darkness. Cooper was his only window to independence, to confidence, to life itself. And now these men were tearing them apart while a police cruiser sat idly in our driveway, the officer seemingly approving this cruelty. After 20 years enforcing federal law from the bench, I was watching it being trampled in my own front yard. They had no idea who they were dealing with. What these bikers and our power-hungry OEA president didn't realize was that they hadn't just targeted any disabled child, they had chosen the son of federal Judge Samuel Parker. And I was about to show them exactly what happens when you mistake a father's patience for weakness. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. My name is Samuel Parker. For 20 years I've served as a federal judge in the Eastern District, interpreting the law with clarity and fairness. But no legal training prepared me for the hardest role of my life, being a single father to my blind son Michael. 17 months ago, a tractor-trailer jackknifed on the interstate, changing our lives forever. The crash took my beloved wife, Claire, and robbed Michael of his sight. At just 5 years old, he woke up in a world of permanent darkness, asking for a mother who would never come home. Those first months, I'd hear him crying in his bedroom at night, calling for her. I'd sit beside his bed until dawn, holding his small hand, both of us drowning in grief too deep for words. The scales of justice felt meaningless when weighed against such profound loss. Michael was once a vibrant, curious child who loved painting sunsets and chasing butterflies. Now he navigates life through sound and touch, flinching at unexpected noises, his small fingers constantly reaching out to map his surroundings. The psychologist warned me about regression, but watching my son withdraw from the world broke something fundamental inside me. That changed the day Cooper entered our lives. The German Shepherd guide dog was specially trained for a young child, a rare arrangement, but Michael's therapist fought for it, arguing that early intervention would be critical for his development. The first time Cooper gently nudged his cold nose against Michael's palm, I saw my son smile for the first time since the accident. "He sees for me, Daddy," Michael whispered, his fingers tangling in Cooper's fur. "He's my eyes now." Their bond transcended typical service animal relationships. Cooper became my son's bridge back to the world, his guardian, his best friend. Pine Grove Estates promised a fresh start, an exclusive community with manicured lawns, excellent schools, and a family-friendly atmosphere. The sales brochure featured children playing safely on tree-lined streets. What it didn't mention was Margaret Wilson, the iron-fisted AOA president who ruled with a clipboard and a smile that never reached her eyes. Behind Pine Grove's pristine facade lurked an unspoken preference for appropriate residence, and a complex web of regulations designed to maintain the community's standards. Standards, I would soon learn, that had nothing to do with property values and everything to do with who Margaret deemed acceptable in her perfect world. We moved to Pine Grove Estates in January, after months of searching for the perfect community to rebuild our shattered lives. The real estate agent had glowed with enthusiasm as she guided us through the model home. "Pine Grove is exclusive, Judge Parker," she'd whispered, eyeing Michael and Cooper with barely concealed concern. "Perhaps I should mention your situation to the OA board before you commit?" I declined her offer firmly. "We're just a father and son looking for a home," I said. "My profession and my son's disability are private matters." She hesitated before nodding, but I caught the doubt in her eyes. I deliberately kept my position on the federal bench quiet during the application process, wanting us to be treated like any other family, not given special treatment or special scrutiny because of who I was. The moving van arrived on a crisp January morning, unloading boxes of a life that no longer existed, Claire's gardening books, Michael's easel and paints he would never use again, my family photos from vacations to places my son would now only remember as colors and shapes from before the darkness. The first 2 weeks passed in relative peace as we settled into our new routines. Michael's occupational therapist visited 3 times to help him map the house counting steps between rooms, memorizing the placement of furniture, and learning to navigate the unfamiliar space with Cooper's guidance. On a mild Saturday morning, 3 weeks after our arrival, Michael approached me at breakfast, his small fingers gripping Cooper's harness. "Daddy," he said with determination I hadn't heard in months, "Cooper and I want to explore outside today." My throat tightened with emotion. This was the moment we'd been working toward, a sign that Michael was ready to reclaim some independence. I walked them to the front door, reviewing the route they'd practiced with his mobility instructor. Down our walkway, right turn, 3 houses down to the cul-de-sac, then back. "Cooper knows the way," Michael assured me, his face tilted up with an expression of concentration. From our porch, I watched them navigate carefully down the sidewalk, my tiny son and his massive German shepherd, moving as one unit through a world Michael could no longer see. When they returned 20 minutes later, Michael's face was flushed with accomplishment. "Cooper showed me everything, Dad. He stopped at the curbs and helped me find our driveway." For the first time since the accident, I glimpsed the resilient boy my son had once been. That night I wept silently in my study, tears of both grief and hope. The violation notice arrived exactly 3 days later, slipped under our front door like a declaration of war. "Unauthorized animal on premises, $750 fine. Immediate removal required." I read it twice, disbelief giving way to anger as I felt the embossed Pine Grove Estates letterhead between my fingers. Michael was at therapy, thankfully spared this first salvo. I immediately requested a meeting with the HEOA board, gathering Cooper's service animal certification, ADA documentation, and medical necessity letters from Michael's doctors. The meeting was scheduled for the following evening in the clubhouse, a Spanish colonial building with manicured gardens and a fountain that seemed to whisper of privilege and tease exclusivity. Margaret Wilson sat center at a mahogany table, flanked by 4 board members in business attire. I noticed how her gaze flickered over Michael, my son, sitting quietly beside me with Cooper perfectly positioned at his feet before landing on the dog with undisguised displeasure. "The covenant clearly states no pets over 30 pounds, she began without preamble, sliding the document toward me. "Pine Grove has maintained this standard for 15 years. I placed Cooper's certification paperwork before her. "Cooper isn't a pet, Miss Wilson. He's a federally protected service animal for my visually impaired son." Margaret barely glanced at the documentation before pushing it back across the table. "Your situation doesn't exempt you from our binding agreements, Mr. Parker. Some residents find certain disabilities unsettling. The visibility of it all." She lowered her voice, leaning forward. "There are plenty of appropriate communities for people with special needs. Perhaps Pine Grove isn't the right fit for your family." Michael's small hand tightened around mine as I maintained the calm demeanor that had served me through countless contentious court proceedings. "The Americans with Disabilities Act specifically protects service animals regardless of local regulations," I stated evenly. "Federal law supersedes OA covenants." "Cooper stays." As we left, Michael whispered, "Why does the lady hate Cooper, Daddy?" I couldn't tell him the truth that Cooper wasn't the problem in Margaret's eyes. It was Michael's disability that threatened her perfect community. What followed our confrontation with Margaret was not a single act of hostility, but a carefully orchestrated campaign of intimidation. Within days, security cameras were installed throughout the neighborhood, conspicuously angled toward our property. Each time Michael and Cooper ventured outside, smartphones appeared, documenting their every move, with the transparent excuse of community safety concerns. 3 anonymous calls to animal control claimed Cooper had shown aggression toward children, all dismissed after inspectors found a perfectly trained service animal. But each investigation left Michael more anxious, more reluctant to leave our home. Did I do something wrong? "Daddy?" he asked after the 3rd visit, his small fingers trembling as he stroked Cooper's fur. "Is Cooper bad?" I gathered him in my arms, fury building behind my judicial composure. No, son. Some people just don't understand how special Cooper is. What I couldn't tell him was that Margaret Wilson was systematically targeting a 5-year-old blind child with the calculated precision of someone accustomed to getting her way. The AA board began issuing emergency regulations with surgical precision. All animals must be registered with DNA samples. Residents with special accommodations must submit monthly medical verification. Service animals must wear muzzles in common areas. Each violation carried escalating fines, now totaling thousands of dollars. When I formally contested them, citing federal accessibility laws, Margaret responded with a letter stating, "The board finds your constant complaints disruptive to community harmony. Further disputes may result in lien proceedings." Meanwhile, Michael's isolation deepened. On a warm February afternoon, he heard children playing at the community pool and asked if he could join them. I walked him there, Cooper vigilant at his side. The moment we approached the gate, Margaret materialized as if summoned. "I'm sorry," she announced loudly, "but unscheduled pool usage requires prior board approval." She addressed the watching parents rather than us. Additionally, his special needs require parental supervision in the water at all times. Liability concerns, you understand. The children fell silent, staring at Michael with the unfiltered curiosity of youth. One boy started to approach, clearly fascinated by Cooper, before his mother sharply called him back. "We were just leaving anyway," she said, gathering their belongings with pointed haste. That night I heard Michael sobbing in his bedroom. "Nobody wants to be my friend here," he whispered when I sat on his bed. "They think I'm broken." I held him until he fell asleep, Cooper keeping faithful watch from the floor beside them. In the darkness of my son's room, I made a silent vow Margaret Wilson would not break my child's spirit. The first time I noticed the motorcycles was on a Sunday morning in late February. 3 gleaming Harleys parked in the driveway of a Tudor-style home at the end of our street. The riders stood in the front yard, a tall man with a grayish beard that reached his chest, a younger man with arms completely covered in tattoos, and a woman with a leather vest emblazoned with Raven's Edge MC across the back. Their presence seemed jarringly incongruous in Pine Grove's manicured perfection. Mrs. Davidson, our elderly neighbor who had shown Michael her wind chimes collection, stopped by that afternoon with cookies and a warning. "The Donovans at the end of the street," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the door. "Gregory, his son Axel, and Gregory's sister Rhonda. They're part of that motorcycle club, Raven's Edge. Margaret's been trying to find a way to evict them for months, but Gregory's owned that house for 20 years, before the HOAE even existed." She leaned closer. "Be careful around them. They're different." I thanked her for the warning, but privately wondered if different might simply mean they didn't fit Margaret's narrow definition of acceptable. A week later, Michael and I encountered Gregory Donovan at the community mailboxes. He nodded curtly, his eyes moving from Michael to Cooper with an expression I couldn't quite read. "That's some dog," he commented, his voice gruff. "German Shepherd?" I explained Cooper was Michael's guide dog. Gregory studied my son for a moment before asking, "The kid born that way?" I felt a flash of the defensive anger that frequently rose when strangers questioned Michael's disability. "Car accident," I answered shortly. Gregory nodded again, a shadow crossing his weathered face. "Tough break, kid," he said before walking away, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel. That evening I saw Margaret deep in conversation with Gregory and his son outside the clubhouse, her hands gesturing emphatically as she showed them something on her tablet. When Gregory noticed me watching, he straightened to his full intimidating height and stared back with unmistakable hostility. I didn't know then that Margaret had found her enforcers convincing the bikers that Cooper posed a threat to the community. She had miscalculated badly, not realizing the true nature of Raven's Edge MC, nor understanding that by involving them, she had set in motion events that would expose the rotting foundation beneath Pine Grove's perfect facade. I documented everything meticulously, the way I would prepare evidence for a federal case. Each violation notice, each threatening letter, each incident involving Michael and Cooper, all categorized, dated, and filed with supporting witness statements from the few neighbors brave enough to speak with us. My home office became a war room, walls covered with Pine Grove Estates bylaws, federal accessibility regulations, and a growing timeline of harassment. I'd spent 2 decades analyzing the law from every angle. Now I was weaponizing that knowledge to protect my son. During the day, I maintained my judicial composure, presiding over complex cases with the detached reasoning expected of the federal bench. At night, I pored over civil rights precedents, building a case that could demolish Margaret Wilson's carefully constructed reign of discrimination. I recorded conversations, documented surveillance cameras targeting our home, and photographed every interaction between Margaret and the residents she deemed inappropriate. I was building a legal fortress around Michael, but I couldn't shield him from the psychological toll. The bright, curious child who had once chattered endlessly about dinosaurs and space now spoke only when necessary, his voice soft and uncertain. He stopped asking to go outside. Even Cooper's comforting presence couldn't fully restore Michael's dwindling confidence. One evening, I found Michael in our backyard practicing walking without Cooper's guidance. He was bruised from multiple falls, his small face set with grim determination as he attempted to navigate using only his white cane. "Michael, what are you doing?" I asked, rushing to help him after he collided with a garden chair. His answer shattered my heart. "Learning how to be blind without Cooper," he whispered, "in case they take him away." That night I held my son as he slept, his tears still damp on my shirt collar, and allowed myself to feel the full measure of rage I'd been suppressing through legal reasoning and procedure. Margaret Wilson hadn't just violated federal law, she had made my 5-year-old son believe he needed to prepare for the loss of his best friend, his independence, his connection to the world. No legal remedy seemed sufficient punishment for that crime. The next morning I discovered Michael had been secretly hoarding food in his bedroom, dry cereal, crackers, apples, and keeping them beside Cooper's bed. "It's for when we have to run away," he explained when I found his stash, "so Cooper and I can stay together." I knelt beside him, making a promise I wasn't entirely sure I could keep. "No one is taking Cooper from you, Michael. I won't let that happen." Meanwhile, Margaret's campaign against us intensified. She called an emergency HOE meeting to address growing safety concerns regarding untrained animals in common areas, but deliberately scheduling it during court hours when she knew I couldn't attend. The meeting resulted in yet another amendment to the community regulations. Service animals must be evaluated by an OEA-approved specialist. When I contested this as a violation of the ADA, Margaret responded with calculated indifference. "The board's primary responsibility is community safety. If your animal passes inspection, you have nothing to worry about." What truly concerned me, however, was Margaret's growing relationship with the Raven's Edge members. I frequently observed her in deep conversation with Gregory and Axel Donovan, showing them surveillance footage on her tablet, gesturing animatedly toward our home. After these meetings, the bikers would drive past our house repeatedly, engines deliberately revving as they passed. Cooper would position himself protectively between Michael and the windows, his training overridden by instinct to shield his charge from perceived threats. One afternoon in early March, I returned from court to find Cooper unusually agitated, pacing between Michael and our front door. "What happened today?" I asked, noting Michael's unusual silence. He finally admitted that during their brief walk to the mailbox, Axel Donovan had approached them, commenting on how dangerous Cooper looked and asking detailed questions about when they usually went outside. "He said Cooper might hurt someone someday," Michael whispered. "But Cooper wouldn't hurt anybody, Daddy." I immediately contacted Pine Grove Security, but the officer seemed unmoved by my concerns. "Mr. Donovan is a homeowner in good standing," he informed me with practiced neutrality. "Unless an actual threat was made, there's nothing to investigate." That evening, I installed additional security cameras around our property and began arranging for a private security consultant to evaluate our home. Margaret Wilson had escalated from bureaucratic harassment to something far more ominous, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was building towards some decisive action against us. Mrs. Davidson brought over homemade bread the following morning, her arthritis gnarled hands trembling slightly as she pressed a folded note into my palm along with the loaf. "Neighborhood watch meeting tonight," the note read. 8 p.m. Patel residence. Come alone. Her friends. I was hesitant. It could easily be another of Margaret's traps, but desperation for allies outweighed caution. That evening, I told Michael I had a brief meeting with neighbors and would be monitoring him through our home security system on my phone. The Patels lived across the neighborhood in a Mediterranean-style home fragrant with spices and adorned with colorful textiles. When Dr. Sunil Patel opened the door, I was surprised to find not just his family but 7 other Pine Grove residents gathered in his living room. Mrs. Davidson, Mr. Rivera, a Vietnam veteran who used a wheelchair, the Johnson family, whose adopted Chinese daughters had been subjected to noise complaints, the Goldsteins, whose request to install a kosher kitchen had been repeatedly denied, and most surprisingly, Rhonda Donovan from Raven's Edge, Mississippi, sitting slightly apart from the others. "We've been watching what Margaret's doing to your son," Mrs. Patel said after serving chai in delicate cups. "It's not the first time." One by one, they shared their stories. Mr. Rivera's accessibility ramp cited as a visual nuisance, the Patels' religious holiday decorations resulting in escalating fines, the Johnson girls prohibited from playing outside during quiet hours that seemed to apply only to them. "Margaret maintains what she calls community standards," Mr. Goldstein explained, "but what she means is keeping Pine Grove exclusively for people who look, worship, and live exactly as she approves." Mrs. Davidson nodded sadly. "I've been here 30 years, since before Pine Grove had gates or in Hawaii. It wasn't always like this." Rhonda Donovan, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "My brother and nephew don't know I'm here," she said, her voice surprisingly soft for someone in full biker regalia. "Margaret's been feeding them lies about your dog attacking children in the neighborhood. She's shown them edited security footage making it look like the German Shepherd lunged at the Peterson boy last week. They believe they're protecting the community." I was stunned. "That never happened," I protested. "Cooper is professionally trained. He's never shown aggression." Rhonda nodded. "I believe you. Margaret approached us because we've had our own battles with her. She thought we'd be eager to help her eliminate another undesirable element." Her expression hardened. "My brother's got a blind spot where kids' safety is concerned. There are reasons for that I can't discuss, but Margaret's manipulating him, and I need time to make him see the truth." This clandestine group became our silent support network. Mrs. Davidson would accidentally drop her mail when Margaret was documenting our activities, disrupting her surveillance. The Patels invited Michael to explore their garden of fragrant herbs and wind chimes designed for sensory experience. Mr. Rivera, a former military K-9 handler, would loudly praise Cooper's training whenever Margaret was within earshot. The Johnsons arranged coincidental play dates when Michael was in the park, allowing their daughters to experience Cooper's gentle guidance. These small kindnesses were a lifeline for my increasingly isolated son, whose world had shrunk to our home and the few neighbors who accepted him. Meanwhile, Rhonda worked to convince her brother of Margaret's manipulation, but Gregory remained suspicious. "He's seen the footage," she told me during a furtive meeting at the community mailboxes. "Margaret's planted the idea that you're using your son's disability as a shield to keep a dangerous animal in the neighborhood. Given our history, it's a story he's primed to believe." I asked what she meant, but Rhonda shook her head. "Not my story to tell, just know she's picked her targets carefully." By mid-March, the battle lines were clearly drawn. Margaret had rallied about half the community behind her, residents who valued property values and uniformity above all else. Our small resistance remained largely underground, afraid of becoming Margaret's next targets if they supported us openly. Michael sensed the tension despite my efforts to shield him. One night, as I tucked him into bed, he asked a question that haunts me still. "Daddy, would it be better if Cooper and I went away? Then nobody would be fighting anymore." I gathered my son in my arms, feeling his fragile bird bones beneath my hands, and made a promise I would move heaven and earth to keep Michael. "This is our home. You and Cooper belong here just as much as anyone. Sometimes we have to fight for what's right, even when it's hard." Cooper jumped onto the bed, technically against his training, but a habit I allowed in private, and curled protectively around Michael. My son buried his fingers in the dog's thick fur, drawing comfort from his unwavering companion. "We're not going anywhere," I whispered fiercely. Not you, not Cooper, not me." What I didn't know then was that Margaret Wilson had already set her endgame in motion. Through careful manipulation and selectively edited security footage, she had convinced Gregory Donovan and his son Axel that Cooper posed an imminent threat to neighborhood children. She had scheduled another emergency HEOA meeting specifically during my court calendar, a high-profile interstate commerce case I couldn't reschedule without raising ethical concerns. Most crucially, she had filed a formal complaint with local police claiming Cooper had lunged aggressively at a child the previous day, supporting her claim with doctored footage and 3 witness statements from her most loyal supporters. The trap was set, and I had no idea I was already caught in it. The morning of the emergency meeting, I had an uneasy feeling as I prepared to leave for court. Michael was unusually quiet at breakfast, pushing his cereal around the bowl instead of eating. "Maybe I should stay home today," I suggested, but Michael shook his head. "We're okay, Daddy. Mrs. Davidson is coming over to show me her new wind chimes." I hesitated, then called Mrs. Davidson to confirm she was indeed planning to visit. Somewhat reassured, I knelt beside Michael. "You call me immediately if anything happens, okay?" "I can be home in 15 minutes. Michael nodded solemnly, his fingers tightening in Cooper's fur. "Cooper will protect me," he said with the simple faith of a child who trusted his companion completely. I couldn't know those innocent words would soon be turned against us. As I left for court, I noticed unusual activity on our street, several unfamiliar cars parked near our house, Margaret Wilson standing in her driveway speaking intensely with Officer Bryant from the community security team. More concerning, Gregory and Axel Donovan's motorcycles were parked across from our home, their owners nowhere in sight. A sense of foreboding settled over me, but I was due in court in 30 minutes for a case that had been on the docket for months. I called Rhonda Donovan from my car. "Something's happening," I said without preamble. "Your brother and nephew are at my house. Margaret's there too." Rhonda's intake of breath was audible. "I'll head over now," she promised. "Gregory wouldn't hurt a child, but he's convinced your dog is dangerous. I've been trying to show him the truth, but Margaret got to him first with those doctored videos." I accelerated, torn between my professional obligations and my instinct to turn around. "Just keep them away from Michael and Cooper until I can get there," I urged. "I'll adjourn court as soon as possible." The call ended as I pulled into the courthouse parking garage, duty warring with paternal instinct. I made a decision I would soon bitterly regret. I continued into the courthouse, trusting our support network and the law to protect my son for the few hours I would be unavailable. I couldn't have known that Margaret Wilson had orchestrated this precise scenario, ensuring I would be absent when she made her final move against us. As I took my place on the bench, maintaining the impartial demeanor expected of a federal judge, the mechanism of her plan was already in motion, aimed at the heart of my vulnerable child and the faithful companion who was his connection to the world. I was 90 minutes into hearing arguments on a complex interstate commerce dispute when my clerk rushed into the courtroom, her face pale with urgency. She slipped a note onto my bench. "Emergency," Michael called. "Hallway confrontation at your home. Police present." A cold wave of dread washed through me, but 20 years of judicial discipline kept my expression neutral as I called a 30-minute recess. In my chambers, I immediately called Michael. His terrified voice shattered my professional composure. "Daddy, they're here. Margaret and the motorcycle men and police. They say Cooper attacked someone and they have to take him away. I don't know what to do." I could hear the commotion in the background, multiple voices, Cooper's confused whining, and Margaret's strident accusations cutting through it all. "Michael, listen carefully," I instructed, already gathering my coat and car keys. "Put Cooper on his lead. Show them his service vest and ID. Tell them they cannot legally remove a service animal without proper documentation. I'll be there in 15 minutes. I ended the call and dialed Rhonda Donovan next. "What's happening?" I demanded when she answered. Margaret called an emergency community safety meeting, she explained rapidly. She showed footage of Cooper lunging at the Peterson boy yesterday. Greg and Axel believe Cooper's a genuine threat now. They're there with Officer Bryant to remove the dog. I'm trying to get there, but I'm stuck in traffic. My blood ran cold. Cooper never lunged at anyone. Michael and I were home all day yesterday. Rhonda's voice was grim. Margaret doctored security footage. By the time I discovered what she'd done, Greg had already called the police. I broke every speed limit on the drive home, calling my judicial colleague Robert Mendez to cover my docket. As I approached Pine Grove Estates, I could see the gathering crowd at the end of our street. My judicial restraint evaporated at the sight that greeted me. Michael sitting on our front lawn, tears streaming down his face as he reached blindly into empty air, his white cane thrown carelessly aside. Officer Bryant stood beside his patrol vehicle, its rear door open, Cooper already halfway loaded inside. Gregory Donovan, an imposing figure in his leather vest, stood with arms crossed, while his son Axel held Cooper's leash, keeping the dog from returning to my son. Margaret Wilson moved among the gathering neighbors, her voice pitched to Carrie. The dog lunged at the Peterson boy yesterday. We've had concerns for months. Just because the child is blind doesn't mean we should risk community safety. Several neighbors nodded in agreement, smartphones raised to record the scene. I parked haphazardly and approached slowly, taking in every detail. I needed witnesses to see exactly how far they would go before I revealed my hand. "Officer," I said calmly, though rage pounded in my temples, "may I ask what's happening here?" Bryant, a man in his late 40s with a stiff posture, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "We've received reports of an aggressive animal." "I'm just following protocol." Margaret stepped forward, her perfectly manicured hand gesturing toward Cooper, who sat perfectly behaved despite the chaos. "You were warned, Mr. Parker," she said, satisfaction evident in her voice. "Rules exist for everyone's protection. We have video evidence of your dog threatening a child yesterday." I looked at my son, still reaching blindly for his guide dog, his entire world being torn away by neighborhood prejudice disguised as policy. "Michael," I asked quietly, "did Cooper hurt anyone yesterday?" My son's tear-streaked face turned toward my voice. "No, Daddy. We stayed inside all day because it was raining. Cooper never hurts anybody." Officer Bryant shifted his weight, uncertainty crossing his features. "Mrs. Wilson provided video evidence," Margaret interrupted, her voice sharp. "The child is clearly emotional and an unreliable witness. We have 3 adult testimonies and security footage." Gregory Donovan stepped forward, his weathered face set in grim lines. "Look, I got nothing against the kid, but a dog that attacks children needs to be removed. I've seen the footage myself." Axel Donovan tightened his grip on Cooper's leash as the German shepherd strained toward Michael, sensing his distress. "Dad," Michael sobbed, his small hands grasping empty air, "please don't let them take Cooper. I can't see without him." The raw desperation in my son's voice broke something fundamental inside me. Mrs. Davidson pushed through the crowd, her elderly frame trembling with indignation. "This is outrageous," she declared. "I was with Michael and Cooper all day yesterday. They never left the house." Margaret's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Helen, we've discussed your tendency to confuse days. Perhaps you're thinking of another visit." The elderly woman bristled. "I may be old, Margaret Wilson, but I know what day it is. This is nothing but persecution of a disabled child." Margaret gestured dismissively. "Officer Bryant, please proceed with the removal. The HOA board has voted unanimously." I noticed the paddles and Riveras had joined the gathering crowd, their faces troubled as they witnessed Michael's distress. Officer Bryant moved to close the patrol car door, Cooper now fully inside and pawing at the window, his eyes fixed on Michael. I took a measured step forward. "Officer," I said, my voice deadly calm, "before you continue, I'd like to understand the specific complaint that authorizes the seizure of a service animal." The officer hesitated, Sir, I have a report of aggressive behavior toward a minor. When a service animal displays aggression. And what evidence supports this claim? I interrupted coolly. Any witnesses besides the complainant? Any history of previous incidents? Any actual contact or injury? Bryant shifted uncomfortably. Well, no physical contact was reported, but the animal allegedly displayed threatening behavior. Margaret gestured impatiently. Show him the video, officer. Bryant produced a tablet, playing a grainy surveillance clip showing a German shepherd lunging toward a small child. I immediately recognized the deception. That's not Cooper, I stated flatly. Cooper has a white patch on his chest and a service vest. This footage has been edited or is of a different dog entirely. Mrs. Peterson, the supposed victim's mother, pushed her son forward at Margaret's prompting. Tell the officer what happened, Tommy, she instructed. The child, no older than 6, looked confused. The dog looked at me. He offered uncertainly. Margaret's composure slipped momentarily. Tommy, remember what we practiced. The dog growled and scared you. The boy's eyes widened. Oh yeah, it was really scary, he recited with the wooden delivery of a child repeating an adult's words. From the patrol car, Cooper whined, still struggling to reach Michael. My son's breathing became erratic, his face drained of color signs of the anxiety attacks that had plagued him since the accident. 15 years of judicial restraint evaporated in an instant. Officer Bryan, I said, voice carrying the authority I usually reserve for my courtroom. I have some information that will significantly change how you proceed in the next 30 seconds. Margaret stepped between us, her perfectly coiffed hair gleaming in the sunlight. Don't try to intimidate him, she hissed. The law is clear about dangerous animals. Yes, I replied, meeting her gaze directly, the law is absolutely clear, and you're about to learn exactly how clear it is. The crowd fell silent, sensing the shift in power. Someone whispered, "Who is this guy?" Margaret smirked. Just another resident who thinks rules don't apply to his family's situation. That word, dripping with condescension, was the final catalyst. I removed my overcoat, revealing the suit I had worn to court that morning, and reached for my credentials. I approached Officer Bryant, maintaining the measured pace I used when delivering consequential rulings. Officer, I'm Federal Judge Samuel Parker, Eastern District, I stated, presenting my identification. That service animal is protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and what's happening here constitutes criminal discrimination against a disabled minor. The crowd fell completely silent. Officer Bryant's eyes widened as he examined my credentials. Gregory Donovan's confident posture faltered as he processed this new information. Furthermore, I continued, my voice carrying across the now hushed gathering, I've been documenting this entire harassment campaign for the past 3 months. Today's events now constitute evidence in what will become a federal civil rights violation case. Margaret's face transformed from smug to horrified as the implications dawned on her. You never said you were a judge, she stammered. And you never said you were targeting my son because of his disability, I replied evenly. Yet here we are. I turned to address the neighbors, many still recording with their smartphones. For those documenting this incident, I encourage you to continue. You're witnessing multiple federal violations, including conspiracy to violate civil rights, discrimination under the ADA, and harassment of a protected individual. Officer Bryan immediately stepped back from his vehicle. Judge Parker, I was informed this was an unlicensed aggressive animal. Had I known, I understand you were misled. I interrupted, but I'm curious why standard procedure for verifying service animal status wasn't followed before attempting removal. Bryant paled visibly. Sir, I deeply apologize. This should never have happened. He quickly moved to release Cooper, who bolted directly to Michael, pressing against him as my son wrapped his arms around his guide dog, relief washing over his tear-streaked face. The Donovan men exchanged troubled glances, their certainty visibly crumbling. Margaret showed us video of the dog attacking a kid, Axel said slowly. Said you were using your son's disability as cover to keep a dangerous animal in the neighborhood. Gregory's weathered face darkened as he turned toward Margaret. "You edited that footage? Used us to go after a blind kid's service dog?" Before Margaret could respond, Rhonda Donovan pushed through the crowd, breathless from running. "It's worse than that, Greg," she said, holding up her phone. "Look at the metadata on the video she showed you. It's from 3 years ago, before the Parkers even moved here. It's not even the same dog." Margaret backed away, looking desperately at her neighbors for support, but found only shocked faces. "This is absurd," she sputtered. "We have OEA regulations that clearly state no private regulations supersede federal law," I interrupted. "Something you've been reminded of multiple times in writing." As if a dam had broken, neighbors began stepping forward. The Johnsons described how their adopted daughters had been denied pool access during adult swim hours that seemed to apply only to certain children. Mr. Rivera detailed how his mother's wheelchair ramp had been cited as a visual nuisance. Mrs. Patel recounted how their religious holiday decorations had resulted in escalating fines while Christmas decorations received community awards. "It wasn't just them," Mrs. Patel said quietly. "She's been doing this to many of us." "I have a right to maintain standards," Margaret hissed, her carefully constructed facade crumbling completely. "This is my community. I've worked for years to keep it the way it should be." I took a step forward. "Your vendetta," I said evenly, "just triggered a federal investigation into this entire bait. Everyone involved will be subpoenaed. I suggest you contact legal counsel immediately." Officer Bryant straightened his uniform, his training kicking in now that he understood the situation. "Sir, I'm releasing the service animal back to your son immediately. I'll need to file a corrected report documenting what's occurred here." He turned to Margaret. "Ma, I am. Falsifying reports to law enforcement is a serious offense. We'll need to take your statement at the station." Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but before she could speak, her phone buzzed repeatedly, her board members realizing their liability were calling en masse. The power Margaret had wielded so ruthlessly for years was evaporating in minutes. What happened next surprised everyone. Gregory Donovan walked over to where Michael sat embracing Cooper and knelt down to their level. "Kid," he said, his gruff voice gentler than I'd heard before, "I owe you an apology. Nobody should try to take away something you need to navigate the world." He glanced up at me. "Judge, I was led to believe your dog was dangerous. I have personal reasons for taking threats to children seriously. But I was wrong about your boy and his dog." Michael turned his face toward Gregory's voice. "Cooper would never hurt anybody," he said with the simple certainty of a child. "He's my eyes." Gregory nodded solemnly. "I see that now. And nobody's going to mess with either of you again." He stood towering to his full intimidating height and addressed the crowd. "Raven's Edge looks after its own. The kid and his dog are under our protection now." Axel and Rhonda moved to stand beside him, a formidable trio in their leather cuts. Margaret's face drained of all color as she realized how completely her manipulation had backfired. A text message circulated through the neighborhood within minutes. "Emergency community meeting, 7 p.m., clubhouse, all residents." By then everyone knew exactly who I was and what had happened. Michael, exhausted from the emotional ordeal, fell asleep on the sofa with Cooper maintaining vigilant watch. As I sat beside them, stroking my son's hair, Rhonda Donovan called, "Judge Parker." She said without preamble, "There's something you should know about Margaret Wilson." She had a son 20 years ago. I listened in growing disbelief as Rhonda explained. He was born with severe disabilities. Instead of accepting him, she institutionalized him and erased him from her life. Started over in Pine Grove with a new identity, built this perfect community where everything damaged or different was excluded. The pieces suddenly fit together: Margaret's pathological aversion to disability, her obsession with perfection, her visceral reaction to Michael. "How do you know this?" I asked. Rhonda's voice softened. "Because Gregory's son, his biological son, is in the same facility. That's why he's so protective of children. His ex-wife made the same choice Margaret did, but Greg never gave up on his boy. He visits every week, runs charity rides for the facility. Margaret saw him there once. That's why she's been trying to drive us out, afraid her secret would be exposed. The revelation stunned me into silence. Margaret's cruelty suddenly appeared in a different light, not just malice, but a desperate attempt to escape her own past, and to maintain the perfect facade she had constructed over her deepest shame. That evening I arrived at the emergency community meeting to find the clubhouse standing room only. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact for months now approached us, some with apologies, others with outrage over what they had witnessed. Michael sat beside me, Cooper at his feet, surrounded protectively by the Donovan family and our small network of allies. Margaret arrived flanked by 2 board members, her composure recovered but her authority shattered. She took her position at the podium as if this were any normal HOA meeting, clearing her throat before speaking. "Today's unfortunate incident has been resolved," she began, her voice clipped. "Officer Bryant misunderstood community protocols regarding animals." "That's not true," Bryant himself interrupted from the back of the room. "I was explicitly told to remove a dangerous animal." "The complaint came directly from you, MS?" "Wilson." "Milson." Before Margaret could respond, the entire community erupted in a reckoning that had been years in the making, a cascade of grievances, discriminations, and abuses finally finding voice. As the truth of Pine Grove's toxic governance was laid bare, I watched Michael lean against Cooper, his small hand buried in the dog's fur, and knew that whatever happened next would reshape not just our community, but my son's understanding of justice and belonging in a world he could no longer see. The community meeting ended in chaos, with residents shouting over each other and Margaret being escorted out by security for her own protection. I thought the worst was behind us. Cooper was safe, Margaret's reign of discrimination exposed, and a new chapter for Pine Grove seemingly on the horizon. I was wrong. The trauma of nearly losing Cooper affected Michael more profoundly than I initially realized. The night after the confrontation, he woke screaming from a nightmare, his small body drenched in sweat. "They took Cooper," he cried, his hands frantically searching the bed. "I couldn't find him, Daddy." Cooper immediately jumped up, pressing his muzzle into Michael's hands, but my son remained inconsolable. "They'll come back," he sobbed. "They'll take him when you're not looking." I held him until dawn, Cooper keeping vigilant watch, but sleep never returned. This became our new normal. Night after night, the same terrors. Day after day, Michael's withdrawal deepened. He refused to leave the house, even with Cooper beside him. "It's not safe outside," he'd whisper, clinging to Cooper's fur. Dr. Matthews, Michael's child psychologist, made an emergency house call. "Michael has experienced compound trauma," she explained after spending an hour with him. First losing his mother and his sight, now this threat to Cooper, his lifeline to independence. His brain is in survival mode. She recommended intensive therapy and possible medication if his condition didn't improve, but Michael resisted all attempts to engage. When his occupational therapist arrived for their regular session, Michael refused to practice mobility skills with Cooper. "Why should I learn if they're going to take him away?" he asked with devastating logic. His appetite disappeared. Meals went untouched. Clothes hung loosely on his shrinking frame. Cooper, sensing Michael's distress, rarely left his side, often refusing his own food unless Michael ate first. One afternoon, I found them both asleep on Michael's bed, my son's tear-stained face pressed against Cooper's fur, his small hand clutching the dog's collar as if someone might snatch it away at any moment. I photographed them, not for evidence this time, but to remember what was at stake. 2 weeks after the confrontation, Michael still refused to speak to anyone but Cooper. Dr. Matthews warned me his condition was deteriorating toward clinical depression. "He's experienced a fundamental loss of trust in the world," she explained. "First through losing his sight, now through this threat to his safety and independence." When I reminded her Cooper was safe now, she shook her head sadly. "To Michael, the world has proven itself capricious and cruel. Why should he believe any safety is permanent?" That night I found Michael hiding food again, this time under his pillow. Not snacks for an imagined escape, but dog kibble. "It's for Cooper," he explained in a barely audible whisper, "in case they take me away instead and he has no one to feed him." I gathered my son in my arms, his body frighteningly light, and fought back tears. "No one is taking either of you away," I promised. "We're a family. We stay together." But my words rang hollow against the evidence Michael's other senses had gathered: the crowd's hostility, Cooper's panicked whines from the police car, the cruel satisfaction in Margaret's voice. In his perpetual darkness, those sounds painted a picture no father's reassurances could erase. While I struggled to help Michael heal, my professional life imploded. The day after the community confrontation, I received a formal notice from the Judicial Conduct Committee. Margaret Wilson had filed an ethics complaint alleging I had abused my position to intimidate local law enforcement and circumvent HEOA regulations. Though baseless given the ADA violations, the complaint triggered an automatic review. My colleague Judge Marquez called to warn me. "This is serious, Sam. Using your judicial position in a personal matter crosses ethical lines, even if you were right about the ADA violations." I was temporarily removed from my active caseload pending investigation. Judge Harriet Chin, the committee chair, was clear: "Your actions, while understandable as a father, may have compromised your judicial impartiality. The committee needs to determine if you cross the line from parent to intimidation through judicial authority." I submitted my documentation of the harassment campaign, the ADA violations and witness statements, but the damage to my reputation was immediate. Legal blogs picked up the story: "Federal judge under investigation for abusing position in neighborhood dispute." The investigation consumed my days while Michael's deterioration occupied my nights. Financial pressure mounted as my salary was suspended pending the ethics review. I began to question everything: my decision to move to Pine Grove, my choice to conceal my profession, even my ability to protect my own child. One evening, as I sat reviewing affidavits for my defense, Mrs. Davidson stopped by with a casserole. "You haven't been eating either," she observed, taking in my disheveled appearance. "The boy needs his father strong." She sat across from me, her arthritic hands folded in her lap. "You know, Margaret's filed complaints against half the people who spoke up at that meeting. Violation notices are flying like confetti. She's fighting back hard." I rubbed my temples, trying to ease the constant pressure. I thought exposing her would end this. Mrs. Davidson chuckled without humor. "Tyrants don't surrender power willingly, Samuel. They double down." Before leaving, she pressed a sealed envelope into my hand. "The neighborhood took up a collection. It's not much, but it might help with Michael's therapy costs." I opened it after she left $3,000 in cash and a card signed by 24 residents. I wept for the first time since Claire's funeral. The community itself fractured along increasingly hostile lines. Margaret's supporters, roughly 40% of Pine Grove residents, launched a counteroffensive. Cars driving past our house slowed ominously. Anonymous notes appeared in our mailbox: "Special needs belong in special places and judges should be impartial, not emotional." The Johnsons' lawn was vandalized with spray-painted slurs about their adopted Chinese daughters. Mr. Rivera found his wheelchair ramp deliberately blocked by mistakenly delivered construction materials. The Patels awoke to find their religious statue shattered on their doorstep. Each incident was reported to community security, and each was dismissed as no evidence of intentional wrongdoing. Officer Bryant, who had apologized to us, was reassigned to another district. His replacement, Officer Mercer, made it clear where his sympathies lay. "Some folks just don't understand the importance of community standards," he remarked while taking my report of the threatening notes. "Not everyone is cut out for Pine Grove living." Most disturbing were the new rumors circulating about Cooper. Despite documentation proving his professional training, whispers spread that he had been grandfathered into service animal status without proper certification. Someone anonymously reported us to the State Service Animal Registry, triggering an official review of Cooper's credentials. The Raven's Edge members became our unexpected guardians during this period. Gregory Donovan organized rotating patrols past our house, leather-clad bikers appearing at random intervals throughout the day and night. Rhonda Donovan installed security cameras on their property that happened to capture a view of our street. When Michael finally ventured into the backyard one afternoon, his first time outside in weeks, Axel casually appeared to fix something on his motorcycle parked along the adjoining fence. No words were exchanged, but his presence deterred the smartphone paparazzi who had previously documented Michael's every move. One evening in late March, I received a call from Judge Chen. "Samuel, the committee is concerned about reports we're receiving. Apparently you've aligned yourself with a motorcycle gang to intimidate your Hoa." I explained the Donovan's protective rather than threatening presence, but Judge Chen remained skeptical. "The optics are terrible, Samuel. A federal judge appearing to employ criminal elements as enforcers? Margaret Wilson's attorney is having a field day with this." I bristled at the characterization. "The Donovans aren't criminals. They run a legitimate motorcycle club that raises funds for disabled children." Judge Chen sighed. "Samuel, I'm trying to help you. The committee is split. Half see this as a father protecting his disabled son from discrimination. The other half see a judge who's lost objectivity and is using his position to wage a personal vendetta. These biker associations aren't helping your case." After the call, I sat in my darkened study, the weight of impossible choices crushing me. Should I ask the Donovans to stay away, removing Michael's only sense of security outside our home? Should I surrender my professional ethics defense to save my career? Was Pine Grove worth this battle, or should we simply move again, disrupting Michael's fragile stability? Those questions haunted me as I checked on Michael that night. He had finally fallen asleep, one hand buried in Cooper's fur, the other clutching a framed photo of Claire. In sleep, his face relaxed from the constant anxiety that aged him beyond his years. Cooper raised his head as I entered, his intelligent eyes reflecting the hallway light. The depth of his devotion to my son, unwavering, unconditional, protective, reminded me why this fight mattered. We weren't just battling for a dog or a house or even ADA compliance. We were fighting for Michael's fundamental right to dignity, independence, and belonging in a world that had already taken too much from him. I gently kissed my son's forehead, my determination hardening. Whatever the personal cost, I would not let Margaret Wilson or Pine Grove Estates teach my child that difference meant exclusion, that weakness invited cruelty, that justice was only for those who fit a predetermined mold of acceptability. In that moment, I finally understood Claire's favorite quote, one she had often recited during her own battles with discrimination as a public defender. "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." What I didn't yet know was how unexpectedly that arc would bend in the coming days. The Ethics Committee hearing was scheduled for April 15th, giving me 3 weeks to prepare my defense. My attorney, Eliza Washington, a former clerk of mine who now specialized in judicial conduct cases, was brutally honest in her assessment. "The committee is divided, Samuel. Your documentation of ADA violations is compelling, but using your judicial position during a personal confrontation crosses an ethical line. We worked tirelessly preparing statements and gathering witnesses who could testify to Margaret's systematic discrimination. Meanwhile, Michael's condition improved marginally. He had begun eating again, though he still refused to leave the house. Cooper remained his constant companion, their bond seemingly strengthened by the trauma they had shared. The first unexpected turn occurred on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was reviewing witness statements when the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Gregory Donovan standing on my porch, rainwater dripping from his leather jacket. Behind him, 3 other Raven's Edge members waited beside their motorcycles. "Judge Parker," he said formally, "we need to talk." I invited them in, somewhat apprehensive about what had prompted this delegation. Gregory declined to sit, instead standing awkwardly in my living room, his weathered hands turning his helmet repeatedly. "We've been looking into Margaret Wilson," he began abruptly. "After what happened with your boy, something didn't add up." He nodded to a woman I hadn't met before, introduced as their club secretary, Patricia. She opened a folder containing photocopied documents. "We have contacts at various state agencies," Gregory continued, noticing my questioning look. "Nothing illegal, just people who owe us favors." Patricia laid out their findings methodically. Margaret Wilson wasn't actually Margaret Wilson. Her real name was Ellen Margaret Prescott. 20 years ago, she had given birth to a severely disabled son, whom she had institutionalized immediately. 3 months later, she filed for legal name change, moved across the country, and created an entirely new identity. The documents included her name change petition, which cited personal safety concerns as the reason, and admission papers for her son at Lakeview Residential Facility. "She abandoned her boy," Gregory said, his voice thick with barely controlled emotion. "Changed her name and pretended he never existed. All because he wasn't perfect." I was stunned. This explained Margaret's pathological aversion to disability, her obsessive need for control and perfection. Gregory wasn't finished. "There's more. We found out her son died 8 years ago. She never visited, not once. The facility tried to contact her for funeral arrangements, but she'd left no forwarding information." He ran a hand through his gray beard. "What kind of person erases their own child just because he's disabled?" Gregory's next revelation changed everything. "Judge, there's something I need to tell you about Raven's Edge MC." The other bikers shifted uncomfortably as their leader continued. "We're not what people think. Most motorcycle clubs get a bad rap, but ours has a specific mission." Patricia opened another folder, this one containing photographs of Raven's Edge members at what appeared to be a medical facility surrounded by children in wheelchairs and hospital beds. "We raise money for kids with disabilities, especially those who've been abandoned by their families. We do charity rides, fundraisers, whatever it takes." Gregory's voice roughened. "We also do weekly visits to 3 residential facilities in the state. We bring therapy dogs, organize games, give motorcycle rides to kids who can safely participate." He met my eyes directly. "That's how we knew Margaret, or Ellen, whatever she calls herself now. Rhonda recognized her from Lakeview 10 years ago, though Margaret doesn't know that. She was there with a local politician for a photo op, pretending to care about disabled children while her own son was in the same facility." Gregory looked toward Michael's room, where my son was napping with Cooper. "When Margaret first approached us about your dangerous dog, we had no idea she was the same woman. She showed us edited footage making it look like your dog was aggressive. She told us a blind kid was being used as a shield to keep a violent animal in the neighborhood. Given our work with vulnerable children, we believed her." The big man's shoulders slumped. "I'm ashamed we didn't investigate before confronting your boy. It goes against everything we stand for." This revelation stunned me into silence. The intimidating bikers who had terrified Michael were actually dedicated child advocates. The irony was almost too much to comprehend. Gregory handed me a USB drive. "This contains everything we found on Margaret Wilson, plus witness statements from Lakeview staff who remember her. We'd like to testify at your ethics hearing. The committee should know exactly who's behind the complaint against you." News of Margaret's secret past spread through Pine Grove like wildfire. The same neighbors who had eagerly documented our every move now whispered about Margaret's abandoned child. Her supporters began distancing themselves, uncomfortable with this new information. Margaret herself remained secluded in her home, refusing to respond to media inquiries that mysteriously began appearing on local news sites. The HOA board, sensing the shift in public opinion, issued a statement temporarily suspending enforcement of several controversial regulations pending review. Officer Mercer was suddenly replaced with Officer Jimenez, who promptly opened investigations into the vandalism and harassment our supporters had experienced. But the second unexpected revelation came from a most unlikely source. Tommy Peterson, the 6-year-old boy Margaret had claimed Cooper attacked, appeared at our door with his mother one evening. Mrs. Peterson looked terrified but determined as she asked to speak with me. "Tommy has something to tell you," she said, gently encouraging her son. The child looked up at me with solemn eyes. I'm sorry I lied about your dog, Judge. Mrs. Wilson told me to say he tried to bite me. She gave me $10 and said I could swim in her pool whenever I wanted if I told the policeman the dog was mean. Mrs. Peterson's hands trembled as she handed me a written statement. Margaret has had a hold over many of us, she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. She knows things, financial problems, marital issues, anything she can use. She threatened to expose that my husband and I are behind on our mortgage if Tommy didn't cooperate. She looked toward Michael's room. I cannot imagine how terrified your son must have been. No child should suffer because of adult cowardice, especially not a child already dealing with so much. Tommy's confession prompted an avalanche of similar statements. Neighbors came forward with recordings of Margaret making threats, copies of coercive emails, and testimonies about blackmail tactics used to enforce her vision of community standards. The Peterson family agreed to testify at the ethics hearing, providing crucial evidence that Margaret had fabricated the complaint that led to the confrontation. My attorney was cautiously optimistic. This completely changes the narrative, Eliza explained. You weren't using your position to intimidate, you were identifying yourself to counter a fraudulent complaint orchestrated to harm your disabled son. The final and most unexpected turning point came the day before the ethics hearing. I was preparing Michael for the proceedings. He would not need to testify, but his presence was important to demonstrate the real impact of Margaret's actions. The doorbell rang, and I opened it to find Mrs. Davidson, looking unusually agitated. She was not alone. A distinguished elderly gentleman in an impeccable suit stood beside her, leaning heavily on a carved wooden cane. "Samuel," Mrs. Davidson said breathlessly, "this is my brother, Walter Preston." The name struck like lightning. Walter Preston was the former chief judge of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, a legendary jurist whose opinions were still cited in law schools nationwide. "Judge Preston," I stammered, "this is an unexpected honor." The elderly man fixed me with sharp blue eyes that belied his 80-plus years. "Helen has been telling me about your situation, Judge Parker. I find it concerning on multiple levels." He gestured toward my living room. "May I come in? I believe we have matters of some importance to discuss." Over coffee, Judge Preston revealed information that altered the entire landscape of my case. "I've known Margaret Wilson or Ellen Prescott for longer than she realizes," he began, his voice still commanding despite his age. 20 years ago, I presided over a family court case involving her and her disabled son. She was attempting to terminate all parental rights and obligations, including financial support for his institutional care. Mrs. Davidson nodded sadly. "Walter never discussed his cases with me, but this one affected him deeply. When I mentioned your situation and Margaret's name, he made the connection immediately." Judge Preston continued, "I ruled against her, requiring ongoing financial support for the child. She was furious, claimed I was destroying her chance at a normal life without the burden of an imperfect child." His weathered hands tightened around his cane. "I've followed her from a distance over the years, concerned about her psychological state. When she established herself here in Pine Grove, creating this perfect community with rigid standards of conformity, I recognized the pathology at work." Judge Preston reached into his briefcase and removed a sealed folder. "These are my personal records from her case, along with subsequent documentation of her attempts to appeal my decision. I've also included affidavits from social workers who witnessed her behavior toward her son during mandated visits." He placed the folder on my coffee table. "I would like to testify at your ethics hearing tomorrow. The committee should understand that Margaret Wilson's complaint against you is not about judicial conduct. It's the continuation of a 20-year vendetta against any authority that refuses to accommodate her pathological aversion to disability." I stared at the folder, then at the distinguished jurist sitting in my living room. "Judge Preston, your testimony would be invaluable, but why are you doing this? You retired years ago." The elderly man's eyes moved toward Michael's room, where my son was reading a Braille book with Cooper beside him. "Because justice matters, Judge Parker. Because vulnerable children matter. And because I recognize in Margaret Wilson the same dangerous blend of perfectionism and prejudice that has caused immeasurable harm throughout history. Some battles transcend professional courtesy. Mrs. Davidson squeezed her brother's hand, pride evident in her expression. Walter has never stopped fighting for what's right, even in retirement. Especially in retirement. As Judge Preston prepared to leave, Michael emerged from his room, Cooper guiding him carefully through the unfamiliar arrangement of visitors. Judge Preston stood as Michael approached, a formal courtesy despite the fact that my son couldn't see it. "Hello," Michael said hesitantly, sensing the stranger's presence. "I'm Michael Parker." The elderly judge smiled warmly. "Hello, Michael. I'm Judge Walter Preston, an old colleague of your father's." Michael tilted his head, processing this information. "Are you helping my dad with the people who tried to take Cooper?" Judge Preston knelt carefully to Michael's level, his arthritic joints protesting audibly. "Yes, young man, that's exactly what I'm doing. Cooper is a very fine dog, and no one should have tried to separate you." Michael considered this, then asked with the direct simplicity of childhood, "Were you a good judge like my dad?" Walter Preston laughed, a rich sound that seemed to lighten the room. "I tried to be, Michael, and your father is one of the finest judges I know because he understands that true justice requires both wisdom and compassion." He reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement, and when Michael didn't flinch, gently patted the boy's shoulder. "You and Cooper will be just fine, I promise." For the first time in weeks, I saw my son smile a small, tentative expression, but unmistakably real. That night, as I reviewed my testimony for the hearing, I realized how dramatically the landscape had shifted. What began as a neighborhood dispute had revealed profound truths about justice, community, and the human capacity for both cruelty and redemption. Margaret Wilson's carefully constructed fortress of perfection was crumbling, revealing the wounded, vengeful architect behind its walls. As I checked on Michael one last time before sleep, finding him peacefully curled against Cooper's solid warmth, I felt a cautious optimism. Whatever the ethics committee decided, the truth had emerged not through my legal maneuvering, but through the unexpected courage of ordinary people standing against injustice. Their voices, once silenced by fear, had risen in a chorus that could no longer be ignored. The Judicial Conduct Committee hearing convened in the federal courthouse downtown, a formal proceeding unlike the chaotic community meeting at Pine Grove. The 5-judge panel sat arrayed behind a mahogany bench, their expressions carefully neutral as they reviewed the documentation before them. Margaret Wilson sat with her attorney, a polished corporate lawyer whose designer suit and confident demeanor suggested she had spared no expense in her defense. I sat beside Eliza, Michael, and Cooper positioned directly behind us. The Raven's Edge members occupied an entire row, their leather cuts incongruous in the formal setting, but their expressions solemn with purpose. Judge Preston had been given special accommodation near the front, his distinguished presence drawing murmured recognition from the committee members. As the proceedings began, the committee chair outlined the complaint against me that I had improperly invoked my judicial authority in a personal matter and potentially abusing my position to intimidate local law enforcement and circumvent legitimate community regulations. Margaret's attorney presented a carefully crafted narrative of a resident who simply wanted to enforce safety regulations, only to be threatened by a federal judge who believed himself above local governance. When my turn came, Eliza presented our evidence methodically, the documented pattern of discrimination, the falsified complaint about Cooper, the testimonies from neighbors who had experienced similar treatment. Gregory Donovan's testimony about Margaret's abandoned son caused a visible stir among the committee members, while Judge Preston's account of her earlier legal battles provided crucial context about her motivations. The turning point came during Margaret's cross-examination. Confronted with evidence of her fabricated complaint and false identity, she became increasingly defensive, her carefully maintained facade cracking under pressure. "You don't understand what it's like," she finally burst out, her composure shattering completely. "Living with the constant reminder of imperfection, the stares, the pity, the limitations. I built Pine Grove to be perfect because nothing in my life ever was. Her attorney attempted to call a recess, but Margaret was beyond restraint. That blind boy and his dog threatened everything. I'd worked for a community where everything damaged or different stays outside where it belongs. The admission of discriminatory intent echoed through the suddenly silent courtroom. Margaret seemed to realize what she'd revealed, her face draining of color as she looked at the impassive judges. Before her attorney could attempt damage control, an unexpected voice spoke from behind me. "I forgive you, Mrs. Wilson." The small, clear voice of my son carried through the hushed room. Michael had risen from his seat, Cooper steady at his side. "My dad says sometimes people are mean because they're hurting inside. I think you must be hurting a lot to want to take Cooper away from me." The simplicity of his compassion created a moment of profound silence. Margaret stared at the blind child she had targeted so ruthlessly, her expression shifting from shock to something more complex, perhaps the first authentic emotion she had shown since this battle began. "You don't know anything about me," she whispered, but the venom had drained from her voice, replaced by a weariness that suggested the tremendous effort it had taken to maintain her facade for so many years. "I know what it's like when people think you're broken," Michael continued, his hand resting on Cooper's head for support. "After the accident, when I couldn't see anymore, some people stopped talking to me like I was still me. They talked around me or about me, but not to me. It made me feel invisible." He took a small step forward, Cooper moving precisely with him. "But Cooper doesn't care that I'm blind. He just cares that I'm Michael. Maybe your little boy just wanted you to see him, not his disability." Margaret's careful makeup couldn't conceal the shock that registered on her face, nor the tears that followed, perhaps the first genuine emotion she had allowed herself in decades. Her attorney requested a brief recess, which the committee granted. When proceedings resumed 20 minutes later, Margaret's demeanor had transformed entirely. She requested permission to address the committee directly, and in a voice stripped of its usual polish, made a full admission of her actions against us and others in Pine Grove, thus withdrawal of her complaint against me, and an apology to Michael that, while awkward, contained what seemed to be genuine remorse. The committee's ruling came quickly after that. They found no ethics violation in my actions, acknowledging that while identifying myself as a federal judge during the confrontation straddled an ethical line, but the circumstances protecting a disabled child from unlawful discrimination justified my response. They recommended community service rather than formal censure, specifically suggesting I develop educational materials about disability rights for the judicial education program. Outside the courthouse, media had gathered, alerted to the high-profile ethics case. Eliza handled them expertly, emphasizing the committee's vindication and the broader implications for disability rights. As we prepared to leave, Gregory Donovan approached the other Raven's Edge members flanking him. "Judge Parker," he said formally, "Raven's Edge would be honored to escort you and Michael home." The significance wasn't lost on me. This wasn't just transportation, but a public statement of protection and respect. Michael, sensing the moment's importance, stood a little straighter beside Cooper. "Can I ride on a motorcycle?" he asked hopefully. Gregory laughed, the sound unexpectedly gentle from such an imposing man. "Not today, buddy, but someday when you're a bit bigger, we'll figure out a safe way for you and Cooper both." The transformation of Pine Grove began almost immediately. The week after the hearing, residents voted overwhelmingly to dissolve the existing HEA board and establish a new governance structure with transparency and inclusion as core principles. The Raven's Edge members, revealing their extensive experience with charitable organizations, helped draft new bylaws that protected all residents from discrimination while maintaining reasonable community standards. Gregory Donovan, whose gruff exterior concealed a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of organizational governance, was elected to the new community council alongside Mrs. Davidson, Mr. Rivera, and Dr. Batiste. Their first official act was to remove all regulations that could be used discriminatorily against residents with disabilities, religious differences, or family structures that deviated from Margaret Wilson's narrow definition of acceptable. Margaret herself retreated from Pine Grove shortly after the hearing, putting her house on the market and moving to another state. Before leaving, however, she made one final visit to our home, a tense, awkward encounter during which she presented Michael with a small wrapped package. Inside was a handcrafted leather harness for Cooper, embossed with his name and service animal credentials. "It might keep others from questioning his status," she said stiffly. It wasn't exactly an apology, but perhaps it was the closest she could manage a tacit acknowledgement of the harm she had caused and a small step toward making amends. Michael, with the straightforward acceptance of childhood, thanked her without reservation. As she turned to leave, Michael called after her, "Mrs. Wilson, I hope you find people who like you just the way you are." Her expression as she walked away contained a complexity beyond my ability to interpret, perhaps grief for the son she had abandoned, perhaps recognition of the healing she had denied herself through decades of running from imperfection. 6 months later, on a perfect autumn day, Pine Grove Estates held its first community celebration of diversity. The clubhouse and surrounding grounds buzzed with activity, food stalls featuring cuisine from a dozen cultural traditions, music from various heritages, and activities accessible to residents of all abilities. Michael, wearing a T-shirt with the event logo he had helped design, a circle of diverse houses surrounding the words "different together," moved confidently through the crowd with Cooper. His social circle had expanded dramatically in recent months. No longer isolated, he now had regular playdates, swimming lessons adapted for visually impaired children, and weekly visits from other kids curious about Cooper's training. The Raven's Edge members had become fixtures in the community, but their Saturday morning motorcycle maintenance sessions in the Donovan's driveway drawing a regular audience of fascinated children, including Michael, who loved feeling the different parts Gregory would patiently describe to him. Watching my son navigate the celebration with growing confidence, I reflected on how a community once divided by fear had been transformed through crisis into something genuinely inclusive. Mrs. Davidson joined me, her aged hand resting lightly on my arm. "Your Claire would be proud," she said softly, mentioning my late wife for the first time. "Not just of Michael's progress, but of what you accomplished here." I shook my head. I didn't do this. We all did. Everyone who refused to accept discrimination as normal. As the evening wound down, Gregory Donovan called for attention. Standing on the clubhouse steps, flanked by residents of all ages and backgrounds, he unveiled a new sign for the community entrance. The imposing Pine Grove Estates, a premier community, had been replaced with simpler text, "Pine Grove, where everyone belongs." Michael leaned against me in the gathering dusk, Cooper's solid warmth against his legs, and sighed contentedly. "Home feels like home now, doesn't it, Dad?" In that moment, watching my son's face turn toward a sunset he couldn't see but could feel on his skin, I understood that true justice isn't just about interpreting laws from a bench. It's about creating communities where belonging isn't conditional, where difference isn't merely tolerated but valued, where a blind boy and his guide dog could teach an entire neighborhood how to truly see. In the twilight of our years, we recognize what truly matters. Bikers to seize a little boy's guide dog reminds us that communities are built not by rules and regulations, but by understanding and compassion. Like Michael, many of us face unexpected darkness, whether through illness, loss, or isolation. And like Cooper, we all need guidance to navigate unfamiliar paths. This story speaks to our generation who witnessed civil rights movements and fought for inclusion. We know that justice isn't just courtroom proceedings, it's standing up when the vulnerable are targeted. It's recognizing that behind rigid perfectionism often lies unhealed wounds. As we consider our legacies, let's remember Judge Parker's example, using our lifetime of experience and authority not to intimidate but to protect. Let's be like Mrs. Davidson's steady witnesses to truth. And sometimes let's find the courage of Michael, who offered forgiveness when vengeance seemed justified. Our communities need our wisdom now more than ever. Because in the end, a neighborhood isn't defined by property values, but by its capacity for kindness, especially toward those who navigate the world differently. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.